Okay, so last time we ended with talking about the criteria that separate useful hypotheses from not so useful ones, whether they're circular, not testable, or whatever. A hypothesis is a speculative answer to a question with a lot of research and experiments or correlational studies. We can arrive at a pretty sure opinion of whether or not that hypothesis is true or not, whether or not that speculative explanation is good or not. And hypothesis generation is pretty much the next step that comes after question identification. Framing the question well is, yeah, also very important, a lot like generating a useful hypothesis. So, framing questions well will be our starting point for this discussion. So, we have criteria for a good hypothesis: testable, not circular, not self contradictory. But what are criteria for a good question? Nothing so precise. It's more about how you ask a question than always what the content of the question actually is. So now we're getting into rhetoric, how we use logic and grammar to make communication better, how we interface with other people. And so actually in the articles PDF, I listed one article, How to Ask Questions the Smart Way, by Eric Stephen Raymond and Rick Moen. And it's a pretty good article. It's rather specific, and good questions should be specific. It's specifically focused on asking questions on internet forums, which is useful. They're a huge constantly evolving repository of information for many questions, especially obscure stuff that's specific to the degree that it might not be addressed in a textbook or it's too new. Chances are the place you're going to find it is on a forum. They're almost like, as far as being places to go for intelligent discussions and a lot of unintelligent discussions, they're a lot like online universities. Not so prestigious, not so big, also a lot more accessible though. So in their essay about how to ask questions, Raymond and Moen specifically focus on asking questions on forums. And that's a somewhat unique environment for asking questions. First, your audience isn't very specifically defined. Your audience is anyone else who's on that forum who happens to read it and might have an answer. You don't really know how many people there are. Don't even know what countries they're in generally. It's an open-ended set of potential listeners. And not only is the audience vague, what's their motivation in answering your question? Because chances are, if you've done all the work to post it on a forum, maybe your question is pretty involved. A lot of questions do get answered on forums, and a lot of questions on forums don't get answered. In attempting to help us figure out why a certain question gets answered or not, and how well it gets answered, Raymond and Moen focus on explaining the motivation of people who answer questions on forums. The community on a forum is a lot like and has significant overlap with the scientific community. In both instances, they're intelligent people who've done a lot of research, sort of experts. And generally, these experts share information just because they feel like it. There are people who hire scientists, and there is a such thing as paid technical support. But the only entities that tend to have paid technical support or paid science support are big entities that have a lot of money and have a predictable flow rate of questions. Big businesses, universities, big organizations. And most of us are not big organizations or magnificently wealthy. So we generally don't have science support or tech support staff that are paid specifically to answer questions. When you're asking a question just to the internet on a forum, what you're asking people to do is to donate to you their time and expertise. You're asking for a donation. It's somewhat amazing that anyone gets such a donation ever at all. And so there's a lot of charity there, a lot of good stuff. But for navigating a forum, it helps if we understand the motivation of the people who will or will not be donating their time and expertise. Generally, a question gets answered only if it can be answered. If it's specific enough that someone with expertise could actually work with it. Something like, the program is broken. What should I do? Would probably be too open-ended and vague for even an expert to give a technically useful response. Like, unless you gave a lot more details, but you have to give those details. So, for anyone to have any capacity to answer a question, it has to be sufficiently detailed for them to be able to work on it. Otherwise, whatever their inclination, they can't do much. They could go asking you for all the details they might need, but that's a lot of back and forth interaction, takes up a lot of their time and effort. And they only have so much time and effort. They'd probably prefer to deploy it to the maximal effect and not spend their whole evening trying to help someone figure out what their question really is. So poorly formed questions that lack detail just don't get answered. Also, it's easy to ask a question that's not useful to you, even if the expert could answer it. Such as, can you help me? Yes. No. Generally, try to avoid yes or no answers unless you want a one word response, such as yes, period, or no, period. And sometimes people will just give a yes or no response with nothing else to implicitly point out that you phrased your question poorly. A slightly higher level way to phrase a question poorly is if your question is really focused on a step and not on the end goal. Like, let's say you want to do something. Why? You could ask, okay, I'm sure, how do I do why? But a lot of times people are already trying to get to why and they're stuck on step X. And so ask, how would I use X to do Y? That question tends to box the respondent in. They might answer how you would use X to do Y. But do you really want to use X to do Y, or do you just want to get Y done? I could ask, how do I hammer a nail with just a radio? Well, there probably could be some advanced technical explanation. Well, this part of the radio is actually strong enough that you could hammer a nail with it, but the other 99% of the radio, no, but you have to do it this very specific way. Maybe there is an answer. Do I really want to hammer the nail with the radio, or do I just want to get the nail hammered? If I ask, how do I use a radio to hammer a nail? An expert will probably give a super detailed explanation of the 1 in a million way to actually use a radio to hammer a nail. And even if I follow that advice, it's still gonna be technically difficult to get that nail hammered with the radio. So if you really just want to hammer the nail, it would be better to ask an open-ended, how should I hammer the nail question. And most experts would direct you to the proper tool for hammering a nail. Oh, you should be using a hammer. Why? Never mind the radio. You shouldn't be using that thing. You should be using this tool. When you focus your question on how do I use X to do Y, focusing on a step in the path rather than on the end goal. Well, what if that step is a stupid step and shouldn't be in there at all? Then a good answer focused on that step might still be a very inefficient way to accomplish your end goal. So try to, on the one hand, give enough detail that an expert can actually work on your problem and potentially answer it. But don't try to avoid making your questions so methodologically narrow that the expert sticks just to that path and neglects to point out that there's an easier way to do something. You didn't tell me you wanted the easy way to do it. You asked, how do I use X to do Y? I told you how you use that radio to hammer a nail. It's not my fault you asked me how to use a radio to hammer a nail. If you just wanted to hammer a nail, you should have asked that. Then I would have told you, use a hammer. Do it the simple way with this other tool. In the legal profession, that's called leading the witness. Little different in just general question asking. But there's a tension between being too open and broad, where the expert doesn't have enough info to deal with your question properly, and giving too much info that boxes them in, and they don't use their imagination to give you something different that you hadn't thought of at all. Because if you're having a problem, chances are it's because you didn't think of some higher level thing and you're doing something by an inefficient path. So if there's an answer that involves backing up and doing things a more efficient way, that's probably the answer you really want. It's nice to phrase your questions so that the expert gives you the answer that actually solves your problem. It's possible to ask questions that are too specific, such that even if you get an answer, it still doesn't really advance you all that much in solving your problem. Try to avoid that. Okay, so there's a couple tips on how to phrase a question. But the real larger question is, why do people answer questions at all? Especially in this donation format where they're not getting paid to answer these questions. Why does anyone's question get answered? And how do you make your question be one of the ones that gets attention? And if not answered, at least get some other experts working on it, which will probably be very helpful. Questions that get voluntarily answered for free on forums tend to be questions that are intrinsically rewarding for the expert to answer. Because generally there aren't payment systems set up where you can easily send money to the answerer. Like, people are probably working on those, but at least historically, most of the time, such payment for answer systems don't really exist, at least not yet. So the act of working on the question has to be intrinsically rewarding for the person doing the work to help answer it. Which basically means that it has to be a deep question that no one's really answered before. And so the expert ends up working on it and eventually maybe answering it, not because they care about you, like they don't know you, but because they find themselves intrinsically interested in the question. And they find their own brain thinking about it, whether they care about you or not. Only a specific subset of questions can fall into that category. Deep questions. If it's something that you could just look up in the manual or online, that's probably the answer you'll get. Google is your friend. Read the manual. Do an internet search. And the experts will probably just give you that one sentence directing you to how you could find the answer yourself without really bothering another human. Experts generally don't like donating their effort to people who are asking a question just because they're lazy. And it's easy to tell whether someone's asking just because they're lazy. You look at the nature of the question. If it's something that could be looked up in a few minutes, or would be obvious to someone who's done a little research of their own, then they know that the person asking that question has not done a few minutes of their own work and research, is not a serious colleague, and therefore probably isn't the best person available to donate their time and expertise to. At the other end of the spectrum, if you ask a question that's never been asked before, that even the experts don't know, they'll start wondering about the question themselves. And if the question's never been answered before, chances are there are other people out there in the world, on the forum, in the community of experts, who might also be wondering about that question and be grateful to whatever expert answers it for solving it. Sort of like how the world of professional science or professional math works. Professional mathematicians generally don't sit around serving as human calculators, answering simple math questions for people who were too lazy to answer it themselves or pull out a calculator. Rather, they tend to focus on questions that no one's answered before, and no one knows the answer, so they might be the first one to figure it out, and then everyone will respect and thank them for being the one to figure it out. They tend to work on hard questions, and especially questions that are already framed actionably, framed rather precisely, and in a way where the experts can see why the question's interesting. And so it's really the hardest questions that are most likely to get answered on online forums. And culturally, that's a real lot like how scientific communities, like math included, pretty much any expert community, progresses. Experts tend to work on questions that are unanswered by anyone, and therefore answering it would advance the state of knowledge of the community of experts. Experts tend to act in the semi-selfish interest of the intellects of the community of experts. If you can align your question with the intellectual goals of the experts, if you have a question that's never been answered before and you phrase it neatly and ask nicely, you can get a lot of help for free from the community of experts that are certain sections of the internet. In that sense, the culture that we see in professional math and professional science is homologous with an informal culture of experts that anyone can access. And so by being a critical thinker who spends the time to phrase questions well, we are directly participating in the scientific advancement of humanity in the same tradition as Aristotle and Galileo. Welcome to the proud tradition of critical thinkers in the scientific age.